Maya's hands trembled as she counted the crumpled bills for the third time, hoping somehow the numbers would magically change. $18.47. That was all that stood between her and another sleepless night wondering how she'd make rent. The fluorescent lights of the all-night diner buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across her tired face. At 23, she felt ancient, worn down by double shifts and the weight of supporting her younger brother through college while their mother fought cancer 3 states away. The Rusty Anchor wasn't the kind of place dreams came true. Tucked between a pawn shop and a check-cashing store on the wrong side of downtown, it attracted the kind of customers who paid in exact change and left tips that barely covered the cost of coffee. But it was work. And Maya had learned long ago that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Order up," barked Frank, the grease-stained cook whose vocabulary seemed limited to complaints about the heat, the customers, and life in general. Maya grabbed the plate of overcooked eggs and burnt toast, forcing a smile as she delivered it to table 6, where a truck driver named Bill sat reading yesterday's newspaper. "Thanks, honey," Bill said, pressing a $5 bill into her palm. "You look like you could use some good news." If only he knew. Maya's phone had been buzzing all evening with texts from her brother about a scholarship interview he desperately needed new shoes for, and her mother's latest treatment had insurance gaps that seemed to grow wider each month. But she kept smiling, because that's what you did when the world was crushing you. You smiled and pretended tomorrow might be different. The evening crowd was typical for a Tuesday, a few lonely souls nursing coffee that had been sitting too long, construction workers grabbing dinner before heading home to families they barely saw, and the occasional college student studying under the dim lights because their dorm was too noisy. Maya moved between the tables like a dancer performing a routine she knew by heart, refilling cups, clearing plates, and listening to fragments of conversations about lost jobs, broken relationships, and fading dreams. Around 9 o'clock, a man in an expensive suit walked in, looking as out of place as a diamond in a coal mine. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the cracked linoleum as he chose a corner booth, away from the other customers. Maya approached cautiously, wondering if he'd wandered in by mistake. "Can I get you something?" she asked, noticing how his usually perfect hair was disheveled and his tie hung loose around his neck. "Just coffee," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. Black. His name was David, though Maya wouldn't learn that until later. What she saw was a man who looked like he lost everything that mattered, despite wearing clothes that probably cost more than she made in a month. His shoulders sagged under some invisible weight, and when she brought his coffee, she noticed his hands shaking slightly as he wrapped them around the warm mug. The trouble started when 3 men stumbled in around 10:30, already drunk and looking for someone to blame for their own failures. They were loud, aggressive, and the kind of customers Frank usually kicked out before they could order. But Frank had stepped out for a smoke break, leaving Maya alone with the growing tension. "Look at this fancy boy," one of them slurred, pointing at David. "Think you're better than us with your pretty suit?" David tried to ignore them, focusing on his coffee, but the men weren't interested in being ignored. They moved closer, their voices getting louder, their movements more threatening. Maya felt her heart racing as she watched from behind the counter, knowing she should call the police but afraid to leave the dining room. "I'm not looking for trouble," David said calmly, though Maya could see the fear in his eyes. "Well, trouble found you," another man growled, grabbing David's shoulder. Maya didn't think. She didn't calculate the risks or consider her own safety. She saw someone who needed help, and every instinct in her body told her to act. Grabbing the baseball bat Frank kept behind the counter for difficult customers, she stepped between David and his attackers. "That's enough," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You need to leave now." The men laughed at first, amused by the sight of a small waitress trying to protect a stranger. But something in Maya's eyes, a determination born from years of fighting just to survive here, made them reconsider. Maybe it was the way she held the bat like she knew how to use it, or the fact that she'd positioned herself strategically between them and the exit. Whatever it was, they backed down, muttering threats and curses as they stumbled back into the night. David stared at her in amazement. "Why did you do that? You could have been hurt." Maya set the bat down, her hands finally starting to shake now that the danger had passed. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because nobody deserves to be treated like that." They talked until closing time. David told her about his divorce, how his ex-wife had taken everything that mattered to him, including his relationship with his teenage daughter, how success in business had cost him everything that made success worthwhile. Maya found herself sharing things she'd never told Anania about: her fears for her mother, her guilt over not being able to do more for her brother, the loneliness of carrying everyone else's burdens while having no one to carry hers. When it was time to close, David left a $100 tip on a $15 check. Maya chased him into the parking lot, trying to give it back. "I can't accept this," she said. "It's too much." "It's not nearly enough," David replied. "You saved my life tonight. Not just from those men, but from something much worse." He handed her his business card before getting into a car that probably cost more than Maya's yearly salary. She glanced at it under the streetlight and felt her knees go weak. David Harrison, Chief Executive Officer, Rusty Anchor Restaurant Group. Her hands shook as she realized the truth. The man she'd saved, the broken soul she'd comforted over coffee and shared her deepest fears with, owned the entire chain of restaurants, including the rundown diner where she'd been fighting to survive. 3 days later, Maya was called into the manager's office, certain she was being fired for something. Instead, she found David waiting with papers that would change her life forever. A full scholarship for her brother, complete medical coverage for her mother's treatments, and an offer to become the regional training director for the company's customer service program, with a salary that would let her breathe for the first time in years. "This isn't charity," David said, seeing her tears. "The board approved this because of what you showed me that night. We want every employee in our company to understand what real service looks like, what genuine caring feels like. And there's no one better to teach that than someone who lives it every day." Maya looked around the diner that had been her prison and her salvation, understanding that sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen when we're not trying to impress anyone, when we're just trying to do what's right. Her kindness hadn't been strategic or calculated, it had simply been human. As she signed the papers that would transform not just her future but the futures of her family, Maya realized that saving David had really saved herself. Not through the money or the job, but through the reminder that in a world that often feels cold and uncaring, the simple act of standing up for someone else can create ripples that change everything. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be kind when kindness isn't required. Be brave when bravery isn't rewarded, and be human when humanity feels forgotten.